Great, thank you. So just a few more words about myself. I mean, it's probably it's good to know who you're talking to before getting into the main topic. So I was born and raised in Lviv, and I obtained all my degrees from Ivan Franko National University of Lviv, where I majored in Japanese philology and Ukrainian philology, and my second bachelor degrees was in English. My dissertation, my PhD dissertation, was on semantic structure of the terminological field language policy in Ukrainian and English languages. Speaking simply, that was a contrastive analysis of sociolinguistic terminology in Ukrainian and Japanese languages. And I think I can see Oksana Budkovska, who was my she continued my first approach, and I think she developed this approach using different languages in her dissertation. So I've been a faculty member in the Department of English, not Ukrainian, unfortunately. I will tell you why today. And as Olenka mentioned, I'm a member of Japanese Association for Ukrainian Studies, which I also would like to tell you more today. You can see some of my books on this slide, but let me tell you more during my presentation. So the outline of the presentation, this is Ukrainian Studies in Japan. I call it a long journey from silence to unmuted, Ukrainian language in Japan, and Ukrainian community. Let me begin with Ukrainian studies, and in contrast to Canada, where Ukrainian studies has a long history. In Japan, Ukrainian studies were almost non-existent from my perspective, because they were basically within research institutions or university with Slavic studies, but I must tell that they were really marginalized. And the biggest research centers that specializes in research on post-Soviet and post-communist state, this is how they name themselves, is the Slavic Eurasian Center, located at Hokkaido University. Maybe some of the colleagues had a chance to collaborate with the center, because they have the very long history of collaborating with Ukrainian scholars. And also there are about 15 universities out of approximately 800 in Japan where Slavic studies can be majored. And there is this mainly Russian-focused Slavic studies. There is no department with Ukrainian studies, and there is no Ukrainian language, more or less. I will talk about this later. So to show you the picture of what's happening in Japan, or what was before 2022, I searched for a doctoral dissertation using the keyword Ukraine. So this is a Japanese database where you can just look for the dissertations, and I found that there have been 20 dissertations in total so far. 7 of them focused specifically on Ukraine, covering topics on language situation, culture, and politics. The remaining 13 focused on post-Soviet countries, including Ukraine. And almost all of these dissertations were conducted after 2014, which means that the beginning of Russia's war in 2014 has intensified research interest in Ukraine. By the way, speaking of Russian dissertations on Russia, I was able to find about 500. As you can see, the number is quite bigger. So, however, even in educational institutions specializing in Slavic studies, topics related to Ukraine, as I said, were marginalized and largely viewed through a Russian lens. And the programs in Slavic studies were predominantly Russian-focused and without consideration Ukraine from a global perspective. As an evidence of this, I would like to introduce a very interesting dissertation. This is doctoral dissertation conducted by a Japanese scholar majoring in Soviet and Russia propaganda. His name is Sanshiro Hosaka, and he's currently conducting his research at Tartu University in Estonia. So he just defended this dissertation in April, so this is kind of fresh. But from the topic, from the title, you can see Very interesting situation, what was in Japan before 2022. So nothing but politics, explaining the reproduction of narratives about the events. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, among Japanese scholars and intellectuals 2014, 2019. It gives you quite interesting explanations that unfortunately the Russian narratives in 2014 were really, really strong. And me personally, I could feel it myself because at that time I was in Japan as well, and Russian fake narratives such as Crimea is historical Russian, that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, and that Russian speakers in Ukraine are Russian. Was very often broadcast without scrutiny, and media reported this basically using Russian media. And unfortunately, and in contrast to official Japanese position, because Japan at that time already criticized Russia and imposed economic sanctions, in society, Russian scholars had a very big impact on spreading really fake news on Ukraine. Sanchiro Hosaka, he actually left Japan at this time and was able to conduct his research in Estonia, where probably we have really quite, well, I think, a clear understanding of Ukraine, much clearer than in Asia. So speaking of, Okay, just speaking of other centers of Ukrainian studies, and I would like also to focus on Japanese Association for Ukrainian Studies, which member I am, and unfortunately, which is still very small, but these days plays a significant role in spreading accurate information on Ukraine. So the Japanese Association for Ukrainian Studies was founded in 1994 by Kazuo Nakari, one of very few professors who specialized in Ukrainian studies. He was a professor of the University of Tokyo, the leading Japanese university, and he also became famous due to his work, Dilemma of Independence, Ukrainian Nationalism, where he tried to show all kind of national fight for of Ukrainians for the freedom, for the country. And he was a big friend and still is. He is a professor emeritus. He's still a big friend of Ukraine because he started very important studies, Ukrainian studies in Japan. The association includes not only researchers, it's a little bit different from a typical understanding of association. It usually includes scholars, diplomats, and business people involved in activities related to Ukraine. There are 2 academic meetings are held annually. For example, the next one will be next week. Well, I also will have a chance to present on Ukrainian refugees in Japan. The current president, maybe you heard his name. His name is Yoshihiko Okabe. He's an economist and historian. He's professor of Kobe Gakuin University. And very important these days, very important scholar that helps Japanese society to understand what Ukraine is and who are Ukrainians. The vice president of the association is also a very famous political scientist, professor of University of Tsukuba. Her name is Atsuko Higashina. And these 2 professors play a very big role these days because they're involved in media. And I must tell you that in Japan, scholars are very often collaborate with media. They're interviewed, they are broadcasted on TV, and by doing this, they help society to understand and give knowledge about quite silent country as Ukraine. Association played a quite important role in also some social movements, and one of them was in 2019, the expert group on the transcription of Ukrainian geographical names in katakana was established and issued recommendations on the Japanese transcription of Ukrainian geographical and proper names. Speaking simply, this is what in English Kiev, not Kiev movement is like Japanese version of this movement. And the recommendations of the expert group was adopted by Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs in March 2022. These recommendations these days are quite followed by media who, for the past 3 years, quite often start using Kiev Japanese. In Japanese, it's Kyiv, not Kiev. So changing the kind of vocabulary, right, of Japanese. So these days, it's interesting that not only Kyiv, but Odessa, Chernobyl, Dnipro, and many other geographical names, which are important because the Ukrainian news are covered daily in Japan these days. They are changing understanding of Ukraine. And me personally, I also was involved in editing a few books where I was asked to help with Ukrainian transcription. And I've always insist on using Ukrainian transcription because it helps to reveal Ukrainian identity through the language. It's what's interesting that this word Kiev in Japanese was so popular in 2022 that it was top one new word in Japanese language. So every year there is some kind of ranking of new vocabulary, new words, and Kyiv was number one in 2022. Unfortunately, that was due to a tragic situation in Ukraine, but fortunately for Ukrainian studies, we could feel the importance of our expert group. In 2020, the association established an annual award for contribution to the promotion of Ukrainian studies in Japan. Usually there are two awards, the first and the second, and usually not only scholars, but for example, last year also journalists who cover Ukraine can have this award. And I was honored to have an award in 2023 for my Dictionary of Sociolinguistic Terminology. You can see some pictures of the association. Very often it holds in some it's a hall, it's a Christian hall, so very often you can see a picture with the Christ. It's very interesting. It's a still Protestant, but looks like very religious place for Ukrainian studies. I always say that we are blessed by God just by renting this kind of space. Let me continue. So speaking of what was before 2022, it's important to mention academic and popular science publication on Ukraine. And to say the truth, there are not so many of them before that. So before 2022, publications mainly focus on historical and linguistic research and less frequently on literature and cultural studies. You can see a few publications on history. You can see the translation of Kobzar Shevchenko. You can see, for example, kind of like encyclopedic publication, 65 articles to understand Ukraine that covers like it's an introduction to Ukrainian history and society. You could see just mentioned by me, Professor Kaba Yoshihiko's History of Japanese-Ukrainian Relations, and some translations of Skovoroda and Lesa Ukrainka. Very important historian books, as I mentioned, Kazuo Nakai, and I also would like to add Kurokawa Yuji, who used to be, who was an ambassador of Japan to Ukraine in 1990s. And he has a very interesting story because usually the Japanese diplomats who have mission in Ukraine, they usually major in Soviet countries. Most of them, mostly they speak Russian. However, Kurokawa Yuji, Kurokawa ambassador, he was the only one who was not majoring in Soviet countries. And before Ukraine, he had a mission in Canada. And that's very interesting because he said that it's actually that the Ukrainian studies in Canada had a very big impact on him. And when he decided to write a book, Ukrainian history, it's in the narrative, or you can say also translate tale. He used a lot of historians, English language historians, of course, many of them of Ukrainian origins, like Ora Subtelny. And these kind of books at that time were not accessible in Japan. So he told me that it was really very changing and very different in Japan, that the ambassador is not majoring in Russians, and even more, he knows a lot about Ukrainian diaspora in Canada and in the world. By the way, he was quite criticized by this book because his Ukrainian history was very different from the history that was seen through the lens of Russia. But after 2014, this book was republished many times, and 2022, there were 90,000 copies of this book in Japanese market. And I must tell you that Japanese book market is huge and plays a big role in Japanese society. So to publish in Japan is a really big thing. And if you do it, it helps to contribute to understanding to many things. So continuing this story, I would like to also mention that not only Slavic studies play a role in spreading information on Ukraine. It should be mentioned that since 2014, there has been a noticeable shift in Ukraine within the field of international political studies. The university that I listed here, the professors who belong to this university, they do not really focus on Russia. They focus on Ukraine from the perspective through the lens of NATO, the European Union, with particular focus on national security and international relations. And their role is quite big these days because after 2022, most of Russian scholars, Japanese scholars in Russian, were limited in spreading information on Ukraine because it became quite evident that they are full of Russia propaganda. And the professors who belong to these universities and whose major is international political science, they these days comment a lot on what's happening in Ukraine and what can the impact of Ukraine on the world. And it's very important because it's a new perspective, it's a global perspective. Speaking what was of the changes after 2022, there are not so many, and probably in comparison with North American universities where I can see some new department, maybe not department, but at least like integration of Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture courses. This is not that big in Japan, but Russia's full-scale invasion sparked an interest in different levels and from citizens to academia elite. As a result, a few new centers of Ukrainian studies were opened. One of them is not really center, but it's called unit. That's the research unit for Ukraine and neighboring areas within mentioned by me Slavic Eurasian Research Center. And this new unit, they actively engages Ukrainian scholar in collaborative research. And throughout 2022-2025, many prominent Ukrainian scholars had a chance to visit the center or to participate in the conference online. Among them, we could see Serhiy Pluhi, Larisa Masenko, Mykola Raychuk, and many others. Some of the scholars, as far as I know, are visiting the center these days, and they are fellows of the center. Another big thing which happened just recently, that is last year, Kobe Gakuin University, where Professor Okabe Yoshihiko works. He actually started to chair a new center. It's Kobe Gakuin University Ukrainian Studies Center. And this center, which already has some kind of like regular place, physical location, also is going, I believe, to be an important center for spreading Ukrainian culture and history in the future. Also, the honorary consulate of Ukraine in Kobe was opened at the same time, and the current consul is Okabe Yoshihiko, because he's really plays a big role in the Ukrainian studies in Japan, which is, I believe, very important. What happened with publications? The story with publication is very positive these days, and there are more than 50 books. To say the truth, I already have problems with calculating. It was much easier before 2022 because it was usually like one book per year. this time we have a lot of publication, a lot of books, both academic and popular science on Ukraine, mainly focusing, of course, on Russian-Ukrainian war from the perspective of history, international political scientists, military. There were some also diaries of the war. And among people who published are diplomats, of course, scholars. Many Japanese journalists who visited Ukraine personally, for example, the journalist of Asahi Shimbun, very famous, one of the most famous Japanese newspaper in Japan. They personally were there, they witnessed the war, and after that they published their books. Two of them I would like to pay attention to. Kato Naoki, Rethinking the Invasion of Ukraine Beyond the Great Powers Perspective, and Kuni Senorito, The Russia-Ukraine War, Foreground and Background. These are the books by journalists, and they were actually awarded by the Ukrainian Association for their scope, for their contribution into spreading understanding of Ukrainian situation and the Russians war from this perspective of Ukraine, and that's very important. Hirano Takashi is also a very famous journalist who is in Ukraine. He lives in Ukraine. He has lived in Ukraine for the past, I think, I just don't want to miscalculate, but more than 10 years. And he also published The Russian-Ukrainian War, A Scene from Kiev, Living with the War. And this kind of books have play a big role in spreading information, as I mentioned. Kazuo Nakai, the professor who started the Ukrainian Association, also published an intellectual history of Ukraine, and this time he focused on not only history, but people who participated in Ukrainian nationalism at the end of 19th, the beginning of 20th century. And that's a very also important story because the story of the 19th century and 20th centuries of Ukraine is still much more viewed from the perspective of Russia. There are books, for example, like The Complete History of Galicia, that open the scope about Halychina. One of the book was also mine, and that was also very important experience for me to be able to talk about Ukraine and to talk about identities through history and to explain Ukrainian identity from the perspective of language, religion, and attitudes to the ongoing war. Also, there is a very big shift in translations, and I would like to divide this translation into two parts. They are history of Ukraine and the histories, the books of famous scholars in Western countries were finally translated into Japanese. Among them, you can see Marcy Shore, Serhii Plokhy's The Gates of Europe, and very important and definitely must-know book by Anne Applebaum, This Red Famine, Stalin's War in Ukraine. These books were translated into Japanese, and I believe they will explain many things about Ukrainian identity. Ukrainian literature translations, they also, some of them were already finished, and Shevchenko is, as everywhere, I believe, in the world, is the most translated author in Japan as well. So his collection, Three Summers, was translated by Fuji Etsuko. Fuji Etsuko is the professor who is the most popular for her translations of Shevchenko, starting from 1980s. There were a few translations of Lesa Ukrainka, that's the Stone Master. Also, her drama Cassandra was translated just, I was formed last month, I think, the new book collection of Ukrainian dramas by Japanese professor Marta Shinichi, whose major is Slavic dramas. It's very good to realize that finally Ivan Franko was also translated. Unfortunately, Ivan Franko is still very unknown in Japan, and I believe that's a lot of work for translators. The war poetry by prominent Ukrainian poets like Halina Krug, Mariana Savka, Smilyanska, Irvanets Fursa, and many, many others are continuously translated by Harada Yoshinari, who is also a very famous translator of Ukrainian poetry. He translated Lina Kostenko before Lesa Ukrainka, and now he has a great I think he plays a big role in translating war poetry and helping to understand Japanese, to understand Ukrainian emotions, etc. A very, I think, quite big impact on Japanese society had a Ukrainian dictionary of war by Ostap Slavinsky, who visited Japan, and I believe he's currently also in Japan. His dictionary was translated by very famous professor, Waseda University professor Robert Campbell, who's American, but that was translated into Japanese, and Japanese translation appeared earlier than English. That's important to mention. That Ostap Slavinsky had a real big tour around Japan, and there were a lot of positive comments on his dictionary in Japanese media. There were a lot of open lectures in Tokyo and around Tokyo, and I believe this also is very important for Ukrainians. And that was even time that the dictionary was on the top of sales on Amazon, Japanese Amazon, that was in the section of essays. So that's little by little, step by step, Ukrainian literature is also becoming more recognizable in Japan. Speaking of the language, here, unfortunately, I don't have so many slides, and unfortunately, I don't really have so many positive news, but let's stay positive as all Ukrainians are. So as I mentioned, among the approximately 800 universities in Japan, only 2 had introduced the Ukrainian language as a subject before 2022. And you can see them on the left side. After 2022, the list is becoming longer. So you can see the University of Tokyo, the leading university in Japan, Kyoto University, Kobe University, we have Nagoya University and Kinjo Gakuin University. They introduced Ukrainian as a selective academic subject. Not all of them among Slavic studies, for example, Kobe Gakuin University, they don't have a Department of Slavic Studies, but they offer this subject. And unfortunately, I can still state that Ukrainian is not that popular language, but it also, I think that's the point of, well, that's the matter of Japanese society, which is quite conservative, and the changes usually take more time than in Western countries. And I still hope that the number of the universities that introduce Ukrainian language will increase. It's also important to mention that Ukrainian language is an extracurricular activity. And before 2022, there were 3 universities within Slavic studies that offered a Ukrainian as just what in Ukrainian we called facultative. And after 2022, the list became the number of universities increased. Not so many are doing this, but I believe it also really depends on the social interest in Ukraine. And for example, Hokkaido University, where the Slavic Eurasian Center is located, they didn't offer Ukrainian language for a long time, even though there are so many Ukrainian fellows there. KU University do not really teach Ukrainian as the major, but because they accepted many Ukrainian scholars and students, they do it as an extracurricular activity. Me personally, as I told you, I teach at the Department of English, but in 2022, asking myself what can I do for Ukraine and how can I spread accurate information on Ukraine, I decided that it could be some lecture series on Ukraine history and culture. And This is more popular as I see, there is more interest in culture and history, but I also to try to introduce some extracurricular activity for Japanese students. And last year I had I think 10 students from different departments, different nationalities who were interested in Ukrainian language, and mostly they are interested because they can see the news on TV and they feel that they want support and they feel they want to know more about Ukraine. It also important that the presence of Ukrainian scholars in Japanese university plays a significant role, because when students ask me, how can I help you? I usually start with, let's start from learning. And when you can learn society, Ukrainian society and language, you will understand a lot and you will help by spreading accurate information. So mostly my students are interested in Ukrainian language because they see the Ukrainian professor every day who is not always in a good mood, or sometimes who speak about the war or what's happening in my home country, right? I put some information on Russian, and of course, as I already mentioned, Russian is offered at around 15 university, and as a subject, it offered in many, many more. It would be very long and will take so much time to find for all universities, but believe me, there is so many universities where offer Russian as a second foreign language at universities. So there are still a lot of things to do. But also another thing and another problem with Ukrainian learning is, of course, textbooks for learning. And so far, there are 5 textbooks. They are mainly focused on the beginner levels. And you can see from 1991 till the most recent, which was published by Ukrainian translator Oksana Piskunova. This is the textbooks for the beginners, and usually they have a short grammatical explanation of Ukrainian grammar. But also there is a big problem with the textbooks for the learners of intermediate and advanced levels. Many people who learned Russian, it's much easier for them to start learning Ukrainian. So these people, they finish beginner levels quite easy, and they need textbooks which will help to increase their proficiency, but it's still work to do for us. Another problem, of course, is the dictionaries, and the person who was personally involved in creating dictionary, I can understand that this is a really important thing to do. Unfortunately, there is no comprehensive general vocabulary dictionary by this day, and the biggest one is that covers only 15,000 words. So that's really another thing and another challenge for Ukrainian and Japanese scholars to collaborate and to create general vocabulary dictionary, which is very important for creating whatever book or whatever textbook. And let me briefly explain what's happening with the Ukrainian community, which I also believe is the culture attaché in every country. So a few words about migration in Japan. I must mention that Japan might be, is the famous country with a restrictive immigration policy. If you check the number of a foreign population, you will see quite small number. This is about 3%. And it's this is because historically Japan has quite closed immigration policy, and especially after World War II, Japan mainly focused on accepting high-skilled foreign workers, and this is really very different from Western countries, which accepted low-skilled foreign workers after World War II. There were a few changes in immigration policy in Japan. That was 1980s, when the period of Japan's bubble economy, which led to labor shortages in small companies, basically manual work at factories, construction business, and nursing care. And that was the first shift of Japanese immigration policy. They, without switching to accepting low-skilled foreign workers, Japan introduced a few visas for trainees, like short-term trainees that could cover these shortages. But in 2000s, Japan faced another problem that changes its current immigration policy. As maybe you know, the first problem and the most important problem for Japan these days is aging population. Japan has today the longest life expectancy in the world. This is 85 years for women and 78 for men. And the second is one of the world's lowest birth rate. And because of this, the Japanese population has shrinked a lot. And as a result, in 2019, Japan officially opens its doors to low-skilled and semi-skilled foreign workers. But at the same time, as you can see, Japanese authorities still refuse to recognize that Japan is a country of immigration. And their approach to integration is called immigration without integration. The biggest challenge is linguistic integration. And of course, Japan, which is has this, I would say, image of monolingual society. Learning of Japanese is one of the most difficult languages in the world. It's really difficult, and not all foreigners can make it. So unfortunately, linguistic integration is still one of the biggest challenge. Japan is quite flexible with family reunification, with permanent residence. At the same time, major obstacles are in education, access to education, political participation, and non-discrimination. Speaking about Ukrainian population before 2022, you can see the table. And in comparison, in Canada, it goes without saying that it's a really small number of people. And before 2022, only about 2,000 people Ukrainian people lived in Japan. Reasons for migration to Japan until 2021 were mostly employment, family, and education. The situation has significantly changed after 2022, so let me explain you refugee policy in Japan. So, as I said, Japan has an image of the country with restrictive immigration policy. This is also related to refugee policy. So, from 1978 to 2005, Japan accepted about 10,000 Indo-Chinese refugees. That was the first case when Japan accepted refugees, and they had to ratify the 1951 Refugee Convention and to settle an official program for refugees. But if you can see the number of refugees for the past 15 years, you will see that the number is the lowest globally. So Japan accepts about 1% of applicants, which is probably sounds very interesting for Canada or for anyone who is in Western countries. But Japan really tries to control the flow of refugees, and they have settled two programs. This is Convention Refugee Program and also refugee resettlement program for refugees resetting to the third countries. But when the Russians' full-scale war broke out, there was no program, no mechanism for accepting Ukrainian refugees, which is in a broad sense refugees, right, or forced migrants. And Prime Minister Kishida, the previous prime minister, he announced that Japan would accept Ukrainian nationals seeking asylum, but Ukrainians do not fall under any categories, under any policy in Japan. So they decided to implement completely new immigration mechanism. And instead of calling Ukrainians refugees, as it's more common in Western countries, they call them evacuees, saying that Ukrainians do not fall under this category. So they in March quite that was really very speedy, I think, reaction, because Japan is famous for taking slow time. In March 15, 2022, the Special Act on Displaced Persons from Ukraine was enacted, and Ukrainians were granted a temporary visitor status. Well, in practice, that was that Ukrainians who wanted to come to Japan they were supposed to apply for a visa, for a temporary visitor visa, which is a very common tourist visa in any embassy in the world. And at that time, the visa was issued within 1 day. That was very fast speed. And Ukrainians were granted for staying in Japan for 19 days. After arriving in Japan, they were allowed to change their visa into designated activities. That was 1 year visa. And what's interesting that this visa is a working visa. Because, as I said, there is no immigration mechanism for accepting not refugees. Japanese government introduced this kind of mechanism. So Ukrainians were using one of the working visa, and they were allowed to work. They had access to national health security and many other benefits. And I will just let me show you some programs which were introduced, and support program for Ukrainians. VACU is it has two ways, two models. This is displaced Ukrainians without a guarantor and with a guarantor. Who is guarantor? It could be of any physical person, of a Ukrainian national who lives in Japan, or a Japanese national, or it could be some university or the company that decides to give you visa sponsorship. And usually Ukrainians, and probably this is the most common reason for any forced migrants, that mostly Ukrainians who came to Japan in 2022, they used the second model with a guarantor. Because they had some relatives or friends here. This more than 50% of Ukrainians used this model. And in this time, not only government, but non-government actor, Nippon Foundation, a very famous foundation that help refugees and these days evacuees, they offered their own program, and they offered support program up to 3 years, and they covered 2,000 people. During the first year, the application was closed, because actually during the first year, about 2,000 of Ukrainians arrived in Japan. You can see some benefits from this. So that was the first model that's covering living expense and helping with housing matching, language education, employment through state agency, Hello Work, and support for returning or moving to third countries. In case of Nippon Foundation, this more beneficial, I believe, because this program covers travel expenses to Japan, from Ukraine to Japan, no matter where you come from, daily living expenses. They also help with home furnishing expenses, and support for returning or departure to a third country. Usually, in case of two models, the support was provided by local governments. So Ukrainians usually have housing assistance for free, healthcare access. And in case in Japan, I must say that healthcare access in Japan is quite important, and at the same time it's very different from Northern American system. Everyone is supposed to have health. Can I come up with a word? But everyone, you should be in the part of any. Thank you. Insurance. Right. The healthcare insurance. And even if you cannot cover, like if you do not work, you still can have this national insurance program, which is quite cheap. And in case of Ukrainians, it was really cheap. Local governments help with Japanese language education, childcare, and education. So that is the reason as the fact. And of course, because Japan decided to accept Ukrainian evacuees, and Japan, the country famous for following rules and being quite democratic, like the most democratic Asian countries, they also, as a result, had to start complementary protection status. And in December 2023, complementary protection status was started, and Ukrainians recognized under this status can be granted a long-term residency in Japan. You can see that Ukrainians were able to switch to a new visa, and the status led them to stay in Japan up to 5 years. They were also this time had Japanese language education, which is the same with refugees. There was living guidance, living allowance. And as a result, you can see that 1,619 Ukrainians were granted the status as of December 2024. This is about 70% of all Ukrainian evacuees. And the number of Ukrainian evacuees, you can see this is starting from March 2022. Of course, the first year of the full-scale invasion led to the migration flow. And these days, as you can see, well, I think the last date is in February, the number of Ukrainian evacuees is decreasing, and Japan is actually returning to classic visa issues. So these days it's not that easy to get this evacuee visa. You need to go through very strict screening. And the number of evacuees is quite small. But at the same time, Japan has quite flexible visas for temporary visiting. It's much easier these days to come to Japan as a tourist or as a student. So I believe I see many Ukrainians these days in Japan traveling. It's becoming much more accessible. And of course, let me talk about Ukrainian organizations in Japan. The community of Ukrainians, there are about 4,000 Ukrainians in Japan right now, and the community is small, but I like to say very visible, because of course the full-scale invasion of Ukraine has a very big impact on Japanese media. And I must tell you that I don't know any Ukrainian that would not be giving some interviews or were not covered by media. So in 2022, especially in 2022, everyone was so much involved in talking about Ukraine. We felt a big responsibility of talking about what's happening, fighting with Russian propaganda, telling our story. And I usually say that we finally unmuted to tell the story from our own perspective, not from Russia. There are a few associations, NPOs, and in Japan there is this called GIA, that is General Incorporated Associations. So before 2022, there were two big associations. One of them was located in Tokyo, that is one of the oldest associations, Krayane, and one of them is Nagoya, that is Western Japan. But after 2022, the number of associations increased. And we can see Ukrainian Association in Fukuoka. It's even at south of Japan, a very famous social movement Stand with Ukraine, Japan. Then we have some GIA such as the Domo. It's more about volunteering and organizing some kind of events. And this year, Ukraine House Japan, a very big culture association, which is main goal of which is to spread Ukrainian culture, also started its job. And I'm sure that in Canada there are so many Ukrainian Sunday or Saturday schools, but in Japan so far we have 3. Two of them are very active. This is Geraldce and Berehina in Nagoya. My daughter personally, she's going to Geraldce. It's one of the oldest in Japan, and really also plays a big role in maintaining Ukrainian national identity within Ukrainian children or children with bicultural Japanese Ukrainian children. Speaking of church, there is only one mission of Orthodox Church in Ukraine, that is St. Jude Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which started it's about 20 years ago. And it also plays a very big role because all Ukrainians had the chance to gather together, especially to celebrate Christmas, Easter, and as my research showed, that religion plays a big role overseas and helps also to maintain your cultural identity as well. Okay, I think I almost finished. I just would like to say that many Ukrainians in Japan are very active. And for example, Ukrainian Library, which is which started only like volunteering organization these days, also has a very important role because Ukrainian people have finally a place where they can go and read only Ukrainian books, which were so kind of not accessible before. Well, I don't remember that Ukrainians books were on the shelves of Japanese libraries, but these days Ukrainians themselves do a lot of work for spreading Ukrainian books, and this is mainly volunteering thing. But yeah, as I said, Ukrainian community in Japan is small, but very, very active, and I'm very happy that I'm part of them. I think I am done. So to wrap up, the Ukrainian studies in Japan, I believe it's just the beginning of them. I really have positive I'm positive about this. So the big social interest in Japan, and I must tell you that the solidarity with Ukraine is about 70%. And this is a very big and the biggest solidarity level in Asia. And I really believe that Japanese perception of Ukraine is gradually evolving. And Japan, which is ranking among top 5 in the world, speaking of support of Ukraine, has the potential to become the leading country of academic Ukrainian studies in Asia. A lot of things yet to done, but hopefully, with big hope that also Ukrainian scholars in Japan will have their role here, and the Japanese scholars will collaborate with us, and we will do some very good story in the future. Thank you so much, and дякую.
Well, arigato gozaimasu. Dyakuyu. Thank you, Yuliya. I think for most of our audience, this was a wonderful eye-opener. I'd like to open the floor for questions for a few minutes before we close, or comments. Please use the hand raise button if you can. And if not, we're a small enough group, you can just unmute and speak out, please. Oh, we've got a shy group tonight.
Very common in Japan. Everyone is shy in Japan. It's called the principle of harmony in Japan, though. So not to break the harmony, nobody asks the questions.
Maybe I will start. As I know Yuliya a lot of years, I can start. My question will be about students. Can you tell us, please, more about the audience? Who are they, their age, and mainly the reasons why they choose Ukrainian, and why they want to learn Ukrainian now?
Yeah, so thank you so much. It's a very good question. Speaking of young students, general students and undergraduate students, this is more about solidarity. So in 2022, 2023, when Ukraine was covered by media very openly and very actively, like every single day, there were like live news from Ukraine, and many young people got interested. So what Ukraine? I've never heard about this country. So what is this? I want to start learning. And I also must mention very important fact that in 2022, everyone knows this app, Duolingo. And Duolingo, they offer Ukrainian learning, right? So among Duolingo users in the world, Japan was top 5. So Japanese people got really interested in Ukraine because of many similarities with Ukraine. Let's think about geographical location of Japan. We have the same neighbor. So when I introduce, like, I am from Ukraine, it sounds very far and distant. But when I said we have the same neighboring country, they feel it's more like, strong ties because we have the same neighboring country. Russia is the same just on the left side, right? If you'll check the map. And this is why students are interested. Another thing, let's not forget about Northern Islands. So what's so-called what Russian calls Kurili, but Ukrainian government already authorized this Northern Islands, which is the Japanese way of mentioning the problem that Japan and Russia, they haven't signed a peace agreement after World War II, which means that practically they are in war. And this is another similarity which can help us to have this high level of solidarity. I must also mention that among learners of Ukrainian, not only language as a graduate school students, graduates or undergraduate students, but many people of, well, let's say elderly people, if not to, just not to be very inaccurate, they also very interested in Ukrainian situation. And as I mentioned, this is because of similarities. I offer a special series, lecture series on Ukrainian history and culture, and the average age is 60 plus. And these people, they come to these courses, most of them already retired, saying that they feel they remember the days of the war, or their parents were telling them, or they have some similar stories with Hokkaido, or many like mobility, right? There were a lot of stories about migration from Kuril to Hokkaido, and these people feel also very strong solidarity with Ukrainians. So very different. But unfortunately, Japanese young students are really, really not interested in politics. It's a very big difference with Ukrainian students. When Ukrainian students visit Japan, they notice this difference. So they are very pacifistic, which is, of course, the result of Japanese history after World War II. That was their way of history education. So young people, they are always for peace, but with not really deep understanding what peace means, and that sometimes fighting could be for peace, not for just, some, like in case of Russia and Ukraine, if you compare, I always explain that this is fighting for peace and we need to fight for peace. They have really bad understanding of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Yuliya, I think we're going to have to invite you back for an update at
Yep.
some point. Our time has quickly run out, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
In closing, I would like to thank Oksana Budkovska, who introduced us to you and made this webinar possible. And I hope that our ties will be able to continue to grow and that we will, feel free to share any news that's happening in Japan with us, and we will post it in our newsletter. And
Great.
anyone who has additional questions or comments, please feel free to email us and we'll pass them on to Yuliya.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for
Thank you for giving me this floor. It was a great honor to be with you today. And thank you, Oksana, for introducing me. Canada, Japan is not, I think it's a one fly away. So if you happen in Japan again, and Olenka mentioned she was even in Ibaraki. So I'm really surprised that the world is that small. But it will be even smaller if one day we have a chance to see each other face to face.
I'm sure we will.
Thank
Okay.
you so
Дуже дякую всім.